Dame Frances Yates wrote several immensely influential books about the esoteric traditions that lie behind the art and politics of the Renaissance. She popularized ideas that had been almost unknown outside academic circles and hardly thought of even there. Yates's The Occult Philosophy in the Elizabethan Age was published in 1979. I had it for Christmas. There are several interesting ideas in the book, but one thing that stood out for me was her observations on Francesco Giorgi and the harmony of the world, a vast study of the divine harmony within all things, uniting Platonism, Christian theology, and very remarkably, Jewish mysticism, Cabala. Could this book, published in Venice in 1525, have been an influence in Elizabethan England? And an inspiration for Shakespeare, in particular The Merchant of Venice, a play set in Francesco Giorgi's own city, with its Jewish characters, Shylock and his daughter Jessica, and with Lorenzo's great speech on the music of the spheres. This is so familiar, we might let it wash over us without noticing how very peculiar it is. Sit, Jessica, look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patens of bright gold. There's not the smallest orb which thou behold'st, but in his motion like an angel sings, still quiring to the young-eyed cherubims. Such harmony is in immortal souls, but whilst this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close it in, we cannot hear it. This speech at the beginning of the final act, with its scene of reconciliation, justice, and mercy, seems to reveal the entire play as a study of harmony in the widest sense. But it's not just a bit of gentle poetry. Lorenzo adds a little later, "The man that hath no music in himself, nor is not moved with concord of sweet sounds, is fit for treason, stratagems, and spoils. The motions of his spirit are dull as night, and his affections dark as Erebus. Let no such man be trusted." Mark the music. In the context of an Elizabethan England where some Puritan factions were opposing music in church or anywhere, this is almost intemperate language. Did the anti-Puritan audience stand up and cheer? This isn't just nice poetry, it's about deadly serious matters. Frances Yates, following an American researcher, Daniel Baines, sees the possible influence of the Jewish mystical tradition Cabala in The Merchant of Venice. An important theme in Cabala is the Sephiroth, 10 aspects of God which are woven through all creation. Could the characters in the play represent these divine emanations, performing a ritual drama in which harmony is restored? Before we can look more closely at the mysteries of Shakespeare's play and George's possible influence on its ideas of harmony and possible Cabala, I need to explain who Francesco Giorgi was and what his book is about. De Harmonia Mundi is 1,000 pages of Latin. There's a 16th century French translation, but none in English. I've not read the whole book, how many have, but I have looked at recent research on various aspects of Giorgi. The book is well indexed and can be downloaded on Google Books, so it's easy to search for particular words or topics. Francesco Giorgi wasn't an eccentric occultist studying Cabala in an obscure Venetian garret. He was a leading figure in the Franciscan movement. His book is a profoundly Franciscan book. Even when Frances Yates wrote in the late 1970s, very little was known about the intellectual and mystical aspect of the Franciscans. The true nature of Franciscan thought had been obscured even before the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, when it was quietly put aside and the quite different theology of Thomas Aquinas became dominant. It's only in the last 30 years that much of it has been rediscovered. Francis of Assisi inspired his movement soon after 1200, preaching poverty, simplicity, and a Christ-centered life. Almost immediately, his positive attitude to the goodness of creation inspired intellectuals and early scientists to join the order. If God could be known in creation, it was important to find out how nature worked. For example, the nature of light became a scientific study in the 13th century, famously by Roger Bacon. But Bacon also pursued alchemy in search of the elixir which would perfect body and soul. From the very beginning, music was central to St. Francis and his followers. There's a story of Francis singing, dancing, and playing an imaginary fiddle made of sticks, like a new Orpheus. There's a story that when he was very ill, an angel came to play music to him on a new lute. His brothers had refused to bring a musician to him. This is a much more serious story than it seems. Later variations make the angel a violin player. St. Francis's famous Canticle of the Creatures is a statement about the cosmos and our place in it. Francis sings praises of God with Brother Sun, Sister Moon, the stars, and the four elements, which were believed to have been formed from chaos by harmony, and also with Sister Death. He sings with the harmonious creation, in tune with it. The new basilica in Assisi in his memory was the first place to have specially composed polyphonic music by Julian of Speyer. Assisi was a centre of sacred and instrumental music for centuries. There were important Franciscan teachers and composers into the 18th century. Francesco Giorgi was an important figure in the Franciscan world, theological and political. Theologically, he followed the greatest 13th century Franciscan philosopher and theologian Bonaventure. Bonaventure, like Giorgi, was a follower of Plato and deeply distrusted Aristotle and his Arab commentator Averroes. Giorgi's writings show his knowledge of the great Franciscan thinker Duns Scotus. Francesco was born in Venice on April 7, 1466. It's not known when he entered the Franciscan order. He probably studied at the Studio del Santo, the school of the Venetian Franciscan province. Giorgi, says Giulio Busi, was considered the most eminent preacher of the city in the Basilica of San Marco. In 1500, he became the guardian of the monastery of San Francesco della Vigna in Venice. He famously proposed a grand plan of the church of Francesco della Vigna according to Trinitarian geometry. He was confessor to the Poor Clares, the female wing of the Franciscan movement, and he became the amanuensis and biographer of an important visionary, Chiara Bugni. The Blessed Chiara was a joyful stigmatic. She heard angelic melodies. George's close relationship with the mystic demonstrates their shared devotion to the Blessed Virgin. Giorgi had a wide knowledge of Platonic philosophers, probably thanks to Marsilio Ficino, who had made many works known that had been unavailable in the West throughout the Middle Ages. He also studied Jewish traditions and knew the scholars of the Venetian Jewish community. There's an extensive bibliography of Jewish mystical texts in his De Harmonia Mundi. Giulio Busi says of Giorgi, after Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who was the founder of the Christian Cabala, Giorgi can claim the second place, that is to say that he is certainly the Italian 16th century author who left the most comprehensive and well-documented presentation of Jewish symbolism. Giorgi retired to the monastery of San Girolamo in 1517, but was elected provincial minister of the Franciscans in 1523. His book was published 2 years later. His De Harmonia Mundi, published in Latin in 1525, is a product of Franciscan tradition at a turning point in history when the Franciscan fascination with the laws of nature and a mystical approach to creation was about to be lost for centuries. The harmonious cosmos is an essential part of the Franciscan positive view of nature as good and as revealing God. In fact, George's book might be seen as a vast commentary on Francis's Canticle of the Creatures. George's Harmonia Mundi is divided into 3 books called cantos or songs. Each canto is divided into 8 tones, making a musical octave. The 3 cantos explore in immense detail, firstly, the harmony of creation, secondly, Christ at the center, and thirdly, how the human soul and body can be attuned to God. Like the 13th century Franciscan Bonaventure, Giorgi sees God as the absolute unity from which all things flow. Everything emanates from God, like projection, from love rather than necessity, as Plato thought. Nothing is separate from God. Everything has God within it, its own unity, an idea from Proclus by way of the Greek fathers. Giorgi writes, according to Orpheus, God is one through identity, whereas every other thing is called one through its diversity, dependence, participation, and connection with the true one, which is God. But Giorgi adds a new dimension. Now he creates them in their multiplicity of species. Now he assembles them all into a single inventive idea. And thus, by enfolding them all with the principle from which they emanated, he drives and draws them to unity. In other words, everything is being composed. Individual works are drawn to unity in infinite variety. They can come together to become larger forms. Finally, one great symphony. All things are drawn by love to unity. Harmony is that law within creation that guides everything in its formation in infinite variety. The whole of what is can be imagined as 3 worlds: angelic, celestial, and physical. These 3 worlds are, firstly, the unchanging and eternal angelic world of the 9 orders of angels who pass God's message down to the 2nd world, the celestial spheres, which are eternal but change, which in turn pass the divine influence to the 3rd world, our physical world. This diagram appears in the 1578 French edition of De Harmonia Mundi. The first canto of De Harmonia Mundi describes in detail the orders of angels. The 9 orders of angels influence the 9 celestial spheres below them, and these spheres are the source of harmony. The Middle Ages knew the story of the harmony of the spheres from commentaries on Plato's myth of creation in his dialogue Timaeus, and commentaries on Cicero's Dream of Scipio, which elaborates Plato's myth of a vision of the form of the cosmos told at the end of Plato's Republic. According to these stories, the Earth, which you have to remember meant the entire physical or material world, not what we now know as a planet, is at the center of a spherical cosmos. Surrounding it are a series of spheres. What were thought of as planets, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, were in some way attached to these invisible spheres and seemed to revolve around the Earth as the spheres turned. As seen from Earth, the positions of these spheres, 7 for the planets and 1 for the stars, their varying distances appeared to follow the patterns of a musical scale. The distant 9th sphere was the first mover, the primum mobile, closest to God. Each of these moving spheres emitted a musical note. Plato, in his myth of says that on each one sat a siren, we might call them muses, singing. Giorgi writes, but there are symphonies which are no less signs of heaven, such as those, as Plato tells, are presided over by the various sirens, who are said to be singers to God, who, placed in the firmament, make its influences harmonious. Though we know the cosmos isn't really like that, it seems the Earth revolves around the sun, this ancient image is an image of harmony, which is still true. The cosmos may not be literally made of sounding spheres, but this is an image of the harmony which guides all things and passes on the music of the angels to this changing world. The separate notes of the planets guided nature and together made a perfect harmony, but we were unable to hear the sound. Some reasons were suggested: the heaviness of matter, whatever that is, or sin. The celestial harmonies weave the infinite variety of creation, but certain creatures, plants, stones, belong to each particular planet. For example, Giorgi has chapters headed, "Which things sing with the sun or Phoebus? Which things share their delights with Venus? The properties of Venus are gentle taste, salves, fine smell, and all colours tending to white. Her stone is beryl, her plants rose and myrtle, her animal the dove. Which things sound with Mercury? Mercury has no specific element, since he is the one who interferes. He is the helper and the accelerator. The prudent, the investigators and explorers, and the versatile are mercurial characters. Mercury is the god of the arts, and he supports, in the type of Hermes Trismegistus, philosophy, literature, and the art of focalization and mystification in figures and characters. This is a conventional medieval view of creation, but Giorgi adds an important new dimension: the Sephiroth of Jewish mysticism, Cabala. The 10 Sephiroth are an ancient concept, but the familiar image of them arranged as a tree of life first appeared in print in Joseph Gicatilla's Portae Lucis, Gates of Light, published in Antwerp in 1516. The Sephiroth are aspects or qualities of God which flow down from the highest divine unity through all creation. They cannot be said to be anything other than God. The highest Sephiroth, Kether, the crown, is closest to God. From the crown the emanations flow down through intelligence, wisdom, judgment, strength, mercy, and so on, with Tifereth, beauty, at the centre. These Sephiroth are reflected in the celestial spheres, Tifereth or beauty in the sun, for example. But they are above and beyond the cosmos. These are aspects of God, the harmonies beyond harmony. George's second canto places Christ at the centre, who brings all things together. The third canto looks at the small world, the soul, the microcosm, a term from Plato also used by Bonaventure, which is a cosmos in miniature, and how it can be attuned to God. The hope is that all three worlds will sing together, as in Renaissance polyphony, in which three parts have their own music. As he writes, as in tuned music, the cantors, subcantors, and contracantors do not enter with the same notes, yet come together in the same consonants. Thus the three worlds, which we say have their different notes, come together in the same harmony. Frances Yates ends her chapter on Giorgi and the Merchant of Venice, saying, "It would seem from the Merchant of Venice that Shakespeare found the Christian Kabbalistic philosophy of the Friar of Venice congenial." It would seem. Let's look at Lorenzo's speech again. There are three distinct points to examine. Sit, Jessica, look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patterns of bright gold. What are patterns? Early editions give several spellings. Patens are the small plates which carry the communion bread in the Eucharist, and often act as covers for the chalice of wine. Immediately, Shakespeare has introduced a very strange Christian image into Lorenzo's description of the stars. Then come the lines about the harmony of the spheres. There's not the smallest orb which thou behold'st, but in his motion like an angel sings, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubims. What's this? The harmony of the spheres comes from the traditional planets, but Shakespeare's lines leap beyond the planets to stars and angels. The stars are singing to the cherubim, not to us on earth. This seems extraordinary. These lines might seem rather fancy and poetic. Young-eyed cherubims might make us think of sentimental cherubs, but this is in fact quite correct mystical angelology. The cherubim are always imagined as having childlike faces, but they are far more powerful and startling than sentimental cherubs. The 9 orders of angels were defined by the 5th century writer known as Pseudo-Dionysius. The angels communicate God's will to the celestial spheres, which in turn pour out divine influences to this world in their song. Angels, by definition, communicate with creation timelessly and immediately without the need of language, but their song can only be heard on very rare occasions, when the 3 worlds, angelic, celestial, and earthly, come together. Imagine a traditional nativity. The angels sing in heaven. Mary takes the place of the harmony of the celestial world and has given birth to a new creation in Jesus. Shakespeare is not using the commonplace idea of the harmony of the spheres at all, but is using the imagery of Giorgi. Giorgi's De Harmonia Mundi explains that each order of angels influences a different celestial sphere. The cherubim are the angels which rule the sphere of the stars. We only have to look at page 106 of the French edition of the 1,000-page book to find the chapter on the relationship of the cherubim and the starry heaven, the sphere of the stars and zodiac. Why should Shakespeare have chosen this one specific and correct aspect of the divine harmony? Giorgi says the cherubim are the fountain of ideas. The starry sphere is the sphere of Plato's ideas. I know of no precedent for placing Plato's ideas in a Judeo-Christian heaven. I'll return to this idea of ideas in heaven later. A few lines later, Shakespeare's Lorenzo says that our body, this muddy vesture of decay, prevents us from hearing the heavenly music. Giorgi writes, "Man being therefore washed and tempered, and his instruments being well understood and in harmony, he desires to render harmonious motets and hymns, but at first sight he feels the difficulty, as Plato says, our soul coming from God and enclosed in the body suffers dissonance." Giorgi explains that in Christ, through the 7 sacraments, 7 matching the 7 notes of a musical scale, man makes himself perfect and sonorous with God. Even without considering the possibility that there are subtle references to the mysteries of Cabala in The Merchant of Venice, these few lines in Act 5 could be read as an encapsulation of the whole of De Harmonia Mundi, and they are part of a final act which demonstrates themes of harmony and justice. Francis Yates had doubts about Daniel Baines's identification of the characters with the 10 Sephiroth, but she clearly liked the idea. Baines, who was a former director of the US Food and Drug Administration's Office of Pharmaceutical Sciences and responsible for the rejection of the use of thalidomide in the USA, published a revised version of his work as Shakespeare, Shylock, and Cabala in 1978. He finds many apparent echoes of Cabala in The Merchant of Venice, but these come from many more sources than Giorgi. If the echoes are all genuine, Shakespeare would have had to have been a deep student of Jewish mysticism. One echo which Baines does trace to Giorgi is the use of rain and dew as symbols of mercy, as in Portia's comment in her Act 5 speech that mercy droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven. Portia is a striking example of a character seeming to assume the role of one of the Sephiroth. To Baines, she is the image of Tifereth, the central Sephiroth, beauty, which is associated with the sun. Portia says in that final act, "This night, methinks, is but the daylight sick. It looks a little paler. 'Tis a day such as the day is when the sun is hid. Bassanio replies, we should hold day with the Antipodes if you would walk in absence of the sun. And Portia says, let me give light, but let me not be light. There is a question, though. The Sephiroth lie behind George's book, but are rarely named. The most direct summary of their influence, Canto 3, Book 2, Chapter 7, never names them all, but speaks of intelligences, imitating the early Kabbalistic text, the Sefer Yetzirah. It's as if you need to know them to understand. But, as it happens, Tifereth is discussed in more detail. Giorgi describes Tifereth on page 511. Tifereth is virtue and glory. When Tifereth is placed at the center of the archetype, as in the Tree of Life, it represents the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest could enter, and which in the supramundane world is the place of Jesus, the eternal priest. Let me give light, but let me not be light. Portia, then, isn't the sun, the Sephiroth of Tifereth, or the eternal priest, but she can give light, as she does. Within a few years, the shock of the Reformation led the Roman Church to change its attitudes. It was only after George's death that his work was censored, principally his later book, Problemata, which brings together Christian and Kabbalistic imagery, Plato, Orpheus, Hermes Trismegistus, and alchemy, like astrology, a speciality of the Franciscans, which, he says, is often wrongly used but worthy of faith. And all this to help reveal the ancient secret wisdom. And Giorgi insisted all this was completely orthodox. The inference of Jewish thought was criticized, but it was his belief in universal salvation, everyone can be saved, which led to his work being suppressed. By then, Roman attitudes were becoming entrenched in the Counter-Reformation. The Franciscan tradition, with its emphasis on the goodness of creation, was put aside, and the more Aristotelian theology of Aquinas, promoted by the Dominicans, became dominant. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the authentic Franciscan tradition re-emerged. But this censorship led to a curious development. George's work moved out of the sphere of the Roman Church and was taken up in Protestant countries. But there were quite different reasons why Giorgi and his work might have been seen in a favourable light in England. In 1530, Giorgi worked with Richard Crooke, who was sent to Italy to gather evidence in Henry VIII's case that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was not valid and should be annulled. Henry's case, that it was not permissible in biblical law for someone to marry their late brother's wife. Giorgi drew on the wisdom of his many Jewish scholar friends in Venice, including Marco Raffaelli, a convert to Christianity, to support the case that Henry was right. He was summoned to Rome to discuss the case with Pope Clement VII, the dedicatee of De Harmonia Mundi. Clement was a Renaissance man. He commissioned Michelangelo's Last Judgment and accepted Copernicus's theory that the sun was the center of the cosmos. Henry and Giorgi and all his Jewish advisers might have been right, but Clement could not accept the argument because of the influence of Spain. He couldn't possibly dismiss Henry's Spanish queen. If the Pope had been free to follow George's case, the history of England and the world would have followed a very different course. This exceptionally dramatic event might have supported the reception of George's work in England. And it has been suggested that Giorgi came to England himself in 1530-31. His friend Marco Raffaelli certainly did come to England and was an advisor to the king for several years. Some years later, De Harmonia Mundi became known in France through the 1578 French translation by Guy Lefebvre de la Bauderie. What is inescapably a very Catholic work was taken up by Huguenot intellectuals. Some Calvinists in both France and England had a very affirmative view of creation, echoing George's Franciscan attitudes. The Parisian Académie de Poésie et de Musique at the end of the 16th century was founded by the poet Jean-Antoine de Baïf and the composer Joachim Thibaut de Corville. The Academy was inspired by the Neoplatonic Academy of Marsilio Ficino 100 years earlier. Their aim was to use music and poetry to ameliorate the soul and society. Baïf proposed a new way of setting words to music which followed the meter or rhythm of the words. Words and music perfectly combined would have a miraculous power. The music of the Academy was also influenced by the Venetian Franciscan composer and theorist Josefo Zarlino, a younger contemporary of Giorgi. Zarlino was a passionate defender of the belief that music in itself, through its origin in divine harmony, had meaning and expression. The work of Yeats and Tomlinson suggests that in the milieu of the Parisian Academy, the mystical theology of Giorgi and the musical theories of Zarlino united with powerful effect with the poetry of Baïf in the chansons and psalms of Claude Lejeune. In Shakespeare's time then, Giorgi was being studied and music composed under his influence, which had an actively magical intention. Giorgi's influence in England in the late 16th century is harder to detect. As Francis Yates tells us, Dr. Dee certainly owned a copy of De Harmonia Mundi. John Dee, a puzzling and complex character, was partly mathematician and scientist and partly magician. His most famous activity was his communication over decades with angels. This was done by using various methods of divination, including stones and mirrors, and depended on a medium or scryer to read or speak on behalf of the angels, as they rediscovered the angels' language, Enochian. As Deborah E. Harkness has explained, Dee's motive was to restore the corrupted language of nature, to obtain from the angels the true Cabala, the original language of Adam, so that the corrupted world could be restored. Harkness writes, "The angel conversations confirmed Dee's belief that the natural world was analogous to a text, but the book of nature was not a reliable text. It was an imperfect, corrupt, and decaying text that could not be read properly." If this was Dee's attitude, it puts him completely at odds with the world of Giorgi, with its optimistic Franciscan view of nature. Human nature might be wounded by the fall, as St. Augustine wrote, but creation is not fallen. It's our human failings, sin, which prevent us from reading its language. The angels communicate through harmony, and Christ reattunes us to God, as the third canto of De Harmonia Mundi tells us. Yeats has been criticized for oversimplifying the very diverse range of esoteric and religious thought of the period. Dee belongs to a negative dark school alien to Giorgi. We can leave him to break his staff and drown his books. Francis Yates mentions an interesting anonymous book as a possible influence on Shakespeare. The Praise of Music, published in Oxford in 1586, brought together classical and biblical evidence in favour of the value of music, its antiquity, dignity, and suavity, as some of its chapters are titled. And it argued in favour of its use in both secular life and worship. The book is forceful, even intemperate. This was the time when severe Puritans were arguing against the use of music in church, even condemning all music, or at least condemning the sinful and unwholesome lives of musicians. This was a very serious issue, which concerned the Queen, a great supporter of music. Lorenzo's speech in The Merchant of Venice is a distinctly powerful, even intemperate attack on such Puritans. The praise of music has, in the past, been ascribed to Oxford scholar John Case, but a new edition suggests the author was John Bull, an important and often astonishing composer, particularly of keyboard music. Bull studied at Oxford, where the book was published, but was prevented from taking his doctorate by clowns and rigid Puritans who could not endure church music. He later took his doctorate at Cambridge. Bull became professor of music at Gresham College and organist of the Chapel Royal in London in 1591. Bull was certainly an intemperate character. He possibly travelled in Europe as a spy and later had to leave England after some scandalous behaviour, claiming to have converted to Catholicism. The praise of music includes a quote from Ficino, who himself pretends to be quoting St. Augustine. The same quotation appears in the manuscript Dow Part books, copied in Oxford and including works by Bull. Non est harmonice compositus qui musica non delectata. He is not harmoniously composed who does not delight in music. Following this quotation in the praise of music, nature says, "If I made any one which cannot brook or fancy music, surely I erred and made a monster." This might be a conventional thought, but in context we can't help assuming that such monsters included the anti-musical Puritans, some of whom might be in positions of power. Is this the same thought that lies behind Lorenzo's lines? "The man that hath no music in himself is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils." There might be some readers of the praise of music, and some in the audience of the Merchant of Venice, who knew exactly who Lorenzo was talking about. Perhaps cheering at this point might have been rather dangerous. There's nothing in the book, though, that suggests any direct influence from Giorgi. There are no angels. All the same, Bull might repay further research. In Shakespeare's time, the network of musicians in London working in court and theatre included Venetians. From about 1540, Henry VIII brought several Venetian musicians to England, 5 brothers of the Bazzano family as a recorder consort, and several members of the Lupo family as viol players. Descendants of Lupos and Bazzanos were leading royal musicians into the 17th century. A candidate for Shakespeare's Dark Lady, Amelia Lernier, was a Bazzano. There seems to be no evidence that, as some have suggested, the Bazzanos were Jewish converts. The London musical community would surely have had close connections with the theatre. There was also Thomas Morley, the magical composer, one of only 2 composers who set words by Shakespeare in his lifetime, and who drew on the Venetian theorist Zarlino for his plain and easy introduction to practical music. And there was John Bull. This community of composers, players, singers, and poets meeting in taverns seems a more likely setting where Shakespeare could have engaged in discussions about the value of music and George's musical mysticism than a supposed occult coterie around Dr. Dee. Another writer discussed by Francis Yates as a possible medium between Giorgi and Shakespeare is Edmund Spenser and his extraordinary 4 hymns. The 4 hymns are in praise of love, beauty, heavenly love, and heavenly beauty. Spenser's introduction suggests the latter 2 respond to the youthful indulgence of the first 2, but that might be a conceit. The sacred and secular hymns echo each other. The 4th, a hymn to heavenly beauty, traces the beauty of creation through the celestial and angelic worlds to its source. Though Spenser calls this world base, he sees all things in the cosmos as beautiful, a very different tone to Dr. Dee's negative view. We ascend and see God's creatures. Thou canst not count, much less their nature's aim, all which are made with wondrous wise respect, and all with admirable beauty decked. The most striking parallel with Giorgi is that Spenser has a place in the incorruptible heavens for the world of Platonic ideas, the perfect forms of things, which Giorgi places with the cherubim. Fair is the heaven where happy souls have place in full enjoyment of felicity. More fair is that, where those ideas on high enranged be, which Plato so admired, and pure intelligences from God inspired. I know of no source for this placing of Platonic ideas in the heavens other than Giorgi. It's not found in the great Renaissance Platonist Ficino. The most extraordinary feature of this poem is that above these worlds Spenser places the figure of sapience or wisdom, God's creative assistant. There in his bosom sapience doth sit, the sovereign darling of the deity. Spenser's sapience draws on lines in the book of Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, but is wisdom there an allegory or a personification of an aspect of God? Wisdom for Spenser is harmony herself, God's first created thing, through which all other things are formed. And in her hand a sceptre she doth hold, with which she rules the house of God on high, and manageth the ever-moving sky. And in the same these lower creatures all subjected to her power imperial. Both heaven and earth obey unto her will, and all the creatures which they both contain. For of her fullness which the world doth fill, they all partake, and do in state remain, as their great Maker did at first ordain. Reading Spenser's four hymns as a whole, we can see sapience is a parallel with Venus Urania in his secular and Platonic hymn to beauty, a much more ancient personification of harmony, but at heart the same thing. Giorgi writes extensively about sapientia, or sapience, as it is in the French tradition, in De Harmonia Mundi, but as the wisdom of Christ rather than as a female personification. But in Giorgi, Mary, as Queen of Heaven, has a similar role to Spenser's sapience. Giorgi tells us that the stars and planets belong to the Queen of Heaven. The 12 signs of the zodiac are represented by the 12 stars that crown the Blessed Virgin. But more astonishingly, he says, the Virgin Mary, exalted over all the angels, controls the movements of the 7 planets. This wasn't too strange for a Franciscan with a devotion to Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception. In the 13th century, Bonaventure had called Mary the mother of the fabric of the cosmos. Even after George's work was censored in Rome, he was read in Spain, where the Franciscans supported such ideas in opposition to the Dominicans. Such language would have been unacceptable in late 16th century England. In John Case's Sphere of the State in 1588, Queen Elizabeth takes the place of Spenser's Sapience, or the Virgin. But it's still an affirmation of the same law of harmony, on this level guiding government. The centre of this cosmos is immovable justice. The echoes of Giorgi in Shakespeare might be accidental. They might have been transmitted through the musical community, but there's a possibility that the playwright would have been sympathetic to the Venetians' Franciscan worldview. In Elizabethan England, friars and monks were remembered either as figures of fun or as sinister and evil characters, as in Robert Greene's play Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, and Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. I charge thee to return and change thy shape. Thou art too ugly to attend on me. Go and return an old Franciscan friar. That holy shape becomes a devil best. In contrast, Shakespeare's plays include at least 10 characters who are good Franciscans, most famously Friar Lawrence in Romeo and Juliet. Measure for Measure has a complex Franciscan background. The Duke is disguised as a friar, Isabella as a votarist of St. Clare. The common themes through this whole story are the belief, so important to the Franciscans, in the essential goodness of creation, and a belief in harmony as a divine law in nature, which includes human nature and the working of justice. This was a deadly serious matter, In England, some Puritans, not all, certain deists and materialists would oppose such an optimistic view for the next 2 or more centuries. But what is harmony? Harmony is beyond number. The Sephiroth which lie behind George's De Harmonia Mundi might be reflected in planets or number, but they are beyond even the harmony of this world, and yet present in all things. In spite of the muddy vesture of decay, we sometimes seem to remember the heavenly music. The praise of music says that the Platonics and Pythagoreans think all souls are at the recordation of that celestial music whereof they were partakers in heaven before they entered into their bodies, so wonderfully delighted that no man can be found so hard-hearted which is not exceedingly allured with the sweetness thereof. Perhaps we can hear the same heavenly harmonies woven into the music of nature. Was it this that Caliban heard on his island? Sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not.